possible? I haven't even given you my certificate signing request. How could you validate this, without even seeing the CSR, right? And so, I submit a support ticket, and I tried another one in a different company, and the exact same thing happened. And I escalate these support tickets up through the infrastructure. And finally, I'm talking to some support person on the phone, and he's like, kind of confused, and he's like typing stuff. And he's like, "Oh, yeah, you're banned from our system. We're not allowed to issue SSL certificates to you." Fucking hell, man. So that was annoying. But I did eventually get a certificate, and then there was even more drama with that. But so the nice thing about this system, right, is that there are existing anonymity proxies, right? Things like the Tor project provide very strong anonymity guarantees. But the problem is that they're quite slow. Tor gives you a lot, but it also requires a lot. And it's really not feasible for just sort of day-to-day usage. You wouldn't proxy all of your Google search requests through Tor. You would have some productivity problems if you did that. And so what Google sharing is designed to do is be lightning fast, that it should be imperceptible to the user, and that you can literally just leave it on all the time. For things like high-value search requests where you still want some strong promise of anonymity, you should continue to use Tor. But for your day-to-day thing where you're trying to prevent Google from building a profile of information on you, that's where Google sharing thrives. So how does it look? Well, it looks identical to just using the Google services normally. That you can use things like Google Maps, you can use things like Google News. Any Google service happens totally transparently. The only difference is in the bottom right corner, there's just a little status thing saying that Google sharing is enabled and working. If at any point you need to log into something like Gmail, if you're using that, then it will happen totally transparently. Google sharing just won't proxy that stuff, and you can go straight to Google. So this thing is available at googlesharing.net. Another project, thinking about anonymizing your access to Google, it's sort of a straightforward problem, right? Because your intention isn't actually to share information with Google. When you're using Google, your intention isn't to give them your information. You're actually just trying to make use of some services. And anonymizing things, other services that have privacy implications are sometimes more difficult because, for instance, in the case of something like Facebook, your intention really is to be sharing information. So one project that I sort of like in this area is this thing called Face Cloak that was developed by this professor at Waterloo, Urs Hengartner. And the way it works is it's, again, a Firefox add-on that runs in your browser. And it allows you to use Facebook totally normally, only what you can do is prefix any data that you're going to submit to Facebook with 2 @ symbols. And when you do that, it will transparently encrypt the data before submitting it to Facebook. And then the add-on makes it very easy to share your keys with people in your friends network, such that if they're also running the add-on, that will just be transparently decrypted on their end. So the user experience is, again, exactly the same. Everything looks totally normal, and you're sharing information with the people you want to share information to, the selective people in your friends group. And what's important is that Facebook never gets the data. All Facebook ever sees is these encrypted blobs, and to everyone else it looks totally normal. And this project isn't really production ready right now. It's sort of a proof of concept, but I like the direction that it's going, right? Of trying to, again, minimize the scope of the choice that you have to make from whether or not you can use Facebook at all, which I think is becoming an increasingly difficult choice to decide not to use Facebook, that once again, you become cut out of a social narrative, that you can't participate in some form of a society in some way, to allowing you to continue to use Facebook without actually giving all of your information to this company that is going to collect and mine it. Similar things can be said for stuff like Twitter. In some ways, Twitter is like a broadcast medium, but in other ways, it's a conversational medium. And to the extent that it's a conversational medium, you can apply the same tactics. Are there people here that don't tweet? Anybody? Well, oh, right, okay. So, right. You people are my heroes. I tweet now, and something dies inside of me every time I do. But I also recognize that I don't feel like this is a choice that I can continue to make anymore, that I can't just continue to decide, well, I'm not going to participate in mobile phones, or I'm not going to participate in Google or Facebook or Twitter, that I'm realizing that it's not worth trying to, as an individual, make these choices, that instead what I need to do is respond by contributing and working on these projects that try and limit the scope of the choice that we're making. So I think my second thesis here is that the crypto war was largely about data freedom, right? That early on, the problem was people were trying to control information, and the other people on the side of this war were trying to get that information out. And so it was easy to extrapolate from that situation that there was going to be a future of data control. That, in the midst of the crypto war, it looked like this is what things were going to be like forever. And so a lot of the sort of important privacy projects were born out of that reality. And they ended up being things like darknets, data havens, hidden services. Does anybody actually use these things? What do you use them for? So you use them just to see what's going on, right? Right. So one person uses these things as out of curiosity, it sounds like. But for the most part, I don't use these things, and it doesn't seem like anyone else does. And I think that's because it's not the future that we got. That in that moment, in the crypto war, we extrapolated this vision again into the future, just like this vision of this totalitarian future. And we got something else. We got this thing that's a little bit more subtle. And so at the same time, there's this sort of phenomenon lately where privacy advocates tend to love the other. So people that are working on these privacy projects are borderline obsessed with Iranian dissidents or Chinese dissidents. And I don't think that it's because the people that are working on these projects have anything in common with these people in these places. And if you look carefully, they really don't. But just because these are places that are still speaking a language that they understand, that these are places that are still speaking the language of data control. And so that language makes sense with the projects that were born out of this old reality. But I think even these places that are still speaking that language are starting to realize that it's not the most effective thing. That places like Iran have launched a national email service, right? They realize that it's much more effective to be Google than to be doing what they're doing now. That it's much more effective to start by soliciting rather than demanding involvement. That you can start the service and say, we'll give you unlimited storage and free access, and people will sign up in droves, and that is a much more effective technique for collecting information. So I think even these places that are still speaking this old language of data control are starting to realize that there are better methods. I would also say that the loss of the crypto war was less about the eavesdroppers giving up and more about them changing strategies. That, in particular, the strategy of key escrow didn't work out. And so now I think they're deploying this new strategy of key disclosure. And this is manifested in things like RIPA in the UK, which is a law that says, essentially, we're not going to try and regulate the use of cryptography because that's a hard problem. We've tried it before and it failed. So instead, we're going to let anybody use cryptography. You can use whatever you want. But if at any point we want to see what it is that you've encrypted, we come to you when we ask for your key. And if you don't give it to us, we put you in jail. And so this is a problem of key disclosure, which is ultimately a problem of using secure protocols that don't have forward security embedded in them as a part of them. So again, if I'm looking into the future, the first thing that I want to do is start dealing with the choices that aren't really choices. And then I want to worry a little bit less about data freedom, but I want to worry a lot more about forward security. In 2004, Nikita Borisov, Ian Goldberg, and Eric Brewer, their advisor, published a paper called Off the Record Communication, or Why Not to Use PGP. And they made a few very simple but profound observations. People, I'm sure, are familiar with the PGP model, even if most people don't use PGP. But the way it works is if I want to send an email to Bob, I get Bob's public key, and I encrypt the email with Bob's public key, and then I send it to Bob. If I want to send a second email to Bob, I do the exact same thing with the same public key, a third email, and so on. And the observation that these people made in the OTR paper is that if at any point in the future Bob's public key is compromised, that all previous correspondence is also compromised. That if I send an email now, 20 years later, someone could compromise the key that I used to encrypt it, and now that email is compromised, even if it's been 20 years. So the observation is one key compromise affects all previous correspondence. The other weird thing that they notice is that the secrecy of what I write is dependent on your security practices, right? Like, I'm paranoid. I have insane security practices, but how do I know that that's the same for whoever I'm corresponding with? That really, I'd like the secrecy of what I write to somehow be a function of my own security practices as well. And the third thing that they noted is that with these protocols, like PGP, you get authenticity, but there's no deniability.